was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, and the Israelites lived in exile in Babylon. Among them was Ezekiel, son of Buzi, a priest. He was on the banks of the river Chebar when the heavens opened, and he saw visions of God. The hand of the Lord was upon him, and he heard the voice of God calling him to be a prophet. Ezekiel felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that he would have to convey God's messages to the exiled people, who were in despair and without hope. In one of his visions, the Spirit of the Lord led Ezekiel to a valley full of dry bones. He walked around them and noticed that they were extremely dry, indicating that they had been there for a long time. God asked Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel replied, "Lord God, you know." God then instructed Ezekiel to prophesy about the bones, telling them that the Lord would bring the Spirit into them, putting sinews, flesh and skin, and so they would live again. Ezekiel obeyed and began to prophesy as the Lord had commanded. Suddenly, there was a noise, a tremor, and the bones began to come together, each bone to its corresponding bone. Sinews and flesh were seen forming on them, and skin covered them, but there was still no spirit in them. Then God told Ezekiel to prophesy to the Spirit, calling it from the four winds to blow on these dead people so that they would live. Ezekiel prophesied, and the Spirit entered them. They lived and stood on their feet, a huge army. God explained the vision to Ezekiel, "These bones are the entire house of Israel. They say, 'Our bones are dry, our hope is gone, we are cut off.' Therefore prophesy and tell them that the Lord will open their graves and bring them out, bringing them back to the land of Israel. And when that happens, they will know that He is Lord." Ezekiel understood that the vision was a promise of restoration for Israel, a sign that God had not abandoned His people despite exile and desolation. Armed with God's vision and promise, Ezekiel dedicated himself to his mission with renewed vigor. He began to prophesy not only about the restoration of Israel, but also about the judgment of other nations. He spoke of the new heart and the new spirit that God had promised to give His people, removing their hearts of stone and giving them a heart of flesh. Ezekiel knew his mission was difficult, but the vision of the valley of dry bones gave him hope and strength to continue. The people of Israel, in exile in Babylon, were in a state of despair. They remembered Jerusalem and the destroyed temple, feeling abandoned by God. Ezekiel's words were difficult for many to accept, as the pain and loss were profound. However, Ezekiel continued to share the vision of the valley of dry bones, insisting that God was still with them and that there would be a restoration. Little by little, some began to find hope in his words. As Ezekiel continued to prophesy, signs of hope began to emerge. Small groups of Israelites began to meet to pray and study the scriptures. There was a growing sense that God would actually keep His promises. Ezekiel encouraged the people to keep the faith and prepare to return to their land. He constantly remembered the vision of dry bones coming to life, a powerful symbol of what God could do with Israel. Ezekiel received another message from God, talking about a new covenant that He would make with Israel. God promised that He would give His people a new heart and put a new spirit within them. He would be His God, and they would be His people. This message brought great comfort and spiritual renewal to the exiled people. They began to see the vision of the valley of dry bones not just as a promise of physical return to the land, but as a profound spiritual renewal. Finally, God's promise began to be fulfilled. The Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians, and the new king, Cyrus, allowed the exiles to return to their homeland. Ezekiel, although already old, saw the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promises. The people of Israel began to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and restore their lives. The vision of dry bones coming to life became a tangible reality, a testimony to God's power and faithfulness. The return to Jerusalem was just the beginning. The real work of spiritual restoration was just beginning. Inspired by Ezekiel's vision and the promise of a new heart and spirit, the Israelites began to renew their faith and religious practices. Ezekiel continued to teach and prophesy, guiding the people in rebuilding not only their homes and the temple, but also their spiritual lives. The vision of the valley of dry bones continued to inspire and renew the faith of the people of Israel. Ezekiel lived to see the beginning of Israel's restoration. Although he did not see the full completion of God's promises, he knew his mission was accomplished. He left a legacy of faith and hope that would continue to inspire future generations. The vision of the valley of dry bones has become an enduring symbol of God's power to restore and renew, even in the most desperate situations. Ezekiel died peacefully, knowing that he had fulfilled God's calling on his life. The story of Ezekiel and the valley of dry bones continued to be told for generations, a testimony to God's power and faithfulness. The message of hope and restoration has inspired not only Israelites but also Christians throughout the centuries. The sight of dry bones coming to life became a symbol that, with God, there is always hope, even in the darkest situations. And so, Ezekiel's story continues to inspire and renew the faith of all who hear it, an eternal promise that God is able to bring life and hope where there was once desolation.